Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us on today's webinar, User Adoption, Getting Past the Buzz to the Value and Tactics, brought to you by Technology Services Industry Association and sponsored by Ansiley. My name is Inga Triago, your moderator for today. Before we get started, we have just a few housekeeping items. Audio is routed to your computer speakers. If you encounter audio quality or technical issues, let us know right away via the questions panel. You may access full screen view via the toggle button located at the top right area of the console. We encourage you to ask questions at any time via the questions panel. If you don't get to your question today, we will follow up with you via email. And finally, a link to the recorded version of today's webinar and the PDF of the presentation will be sent out in the next 24 hours via email. Once again, thank you for taking the time to join us today. I would now like to introduce our presenters today, John Ragsdale, VP Research Technology and Social for TSIA, and Mal Poulin, Senior Director, Corporate Strategy for Ansiley. We do have a lot of exciting content to share during this very interactive session in the next 30 minutes. Let's go ahead and get started by turning things over to our first presenter. John, over to you.
Thank you, Inga. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We began talking about the importance of user adoption back in 2010 when we launched our first book, Complexity Avalanche. And today we're going to get past the buzz around adoption and share with you some real-world case studies on how TSI members and other tech companies are boosting user adoption, the tactics they're using to do that, and the value, the business value that they're receiving from actually tackling that project. So I thought a good place to start would be a look at customer success. Customer success is probably the #1 hot trend in services today. TSIA launched a new initiative around customer success at our Las Vegas conference last year. And coming up next month, we'll be back in Las Vegas for our 2015 Technology Services World event, and we'll have some new announcements around customer success. But when we surveyed the tech companies who have launched a customer success practice and asked them what the focus of that practice was, we found that adoption is the biggest focus area, and 40% of customer success organizations are trying to better monitor, boost, and measure customer adoption of technology. 37% are focusing on customer retention, 10% on expand selling. So this customer adoption thing is really becoming such a big part of many service operations, and you may be wondering, why does adoption matter? Why is it so important? So the simple answer is that customers who adopt products faster and more fully are going to receive positive outcomes sooner. And according to our benchmark data, on average, customers who are high adopters have higher renewal rates, lower discounts, and tend to buy more additional products from you. And some proof points here from our benchmark database, when we look at renewal rates and we sort those renewal rates according to members who are currently monitoring consumption and those who do not, we see that those who are able to monitor consumption are averaging an 86% renewal rate compared to a 77% average renewal rate for companies who are not monitoring consumption today. So clearly getting a handle on how customers are adopting and consuming your products can really help you better meet those customers' needs and push up those renewal rates. So a couple of tactics here. How do you go about actually improving adoption? One of the first things that I think is really good to do is establish an average adoption curve, and that means looking at all of your customers and start understanding, how many users should they be logging in, how many modules or features or processes within your product should they be using at 1 week, at 6 months, at 1 year, at 3 years. And once you start establishing those average adoption curves, it's going to make it much easier to identify customers who seem to be lagging a bit in reaching the desired consumption rates. I've even seen some companies establish a customer success index where they put a numeric value on each company's adoption based on the number of users, the amount of time they're spending in the system, the number of features, or how fully they're using the capabilities of the system. And that way you can even share this number with your customers and show where they are on that customer success index. Another good tactic is to be proactively reaching out to the lower adopting customers to help them boost their consumption rates. You know, it could be that they need some additional training or mentoring, which actually is an opportunity to sell some additional training or consulting services. So we talked about why adoption matters, but how do you actually go about boosting adoption? And according to the data we have in our benchmarks and the presentations we've been seeing at our conferences, one of the keys to boosting adoption is real-time learning. So that means not necessarily the old approach to learning, which was you put them on a plane, flew them someplace, and stuck them in a classroom for a week, but enabling this online training and e-learning so that as they run into an issue, they can quickly do a module on this feature or this part of the product that they may not have been trained on previously, or maybe they just need a refresher on that. Also, a great idea is leveraging knowledge management or content management to create, manage, publish how-to and best practice information so you don't have to have every customer reinventing the wheel on how to get the most value out of the products. And also, you know, a feature we're seeing more common now is auto-translation capability. So regardless of where the customer is in the world, if they're more comfortable getting that training content in Japanese or in French, they have that option with auto-translation. One of the newer things that we're getting to see that I think is going to be just critical moving ahead is in-application guidance, assistance, and training. And I have a screenshot here from our sponsor today, Ansili. They can actually embed training and guidance within applications, and this is a screenshot from Salesforce. So many of our members are using Salesforce.com for CRM, and you can see that the system is actually prompting them with information as they complete a form to help them complete it faster, especially if it's their first time or they haven't done it in a while. So this in-app guidance assistance and training, not only overviews and manuals and how-to guides that are just a button click away, but also a little assistance in how to complete a process or a task and help them get through that process as quickly as possible. And we can now embed this sort of guidance in any web application. So if you've got a pure cloud application or you've got a web version of an on-premise tool, consider this because it's something that your customers are really going to appreciate and help them boost adoption and just get to value a lot faster. So I'd like to bring in our guest speaker today. Mal Poulin is Senior Director of Corporate Strategy for Ansili. Mal, welcome to today's webinar.
Great, thanks, John. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate you including the screenshot down there as well because I think it really points to home the how-to from our tactical part of today's discussion. So I think, to your point, one of the most important words on here is that word guidance on the top right, because now we're able to support our customers as opposed to only in a classroom, right at their fingertips at the point of need, which is exactly what you said perfectly about the use of an application like Salesforce.
And, you know, applications are becoming so complex today. I think that expecting people to sit in the class for a week and learn everything they're going to need to know is a little unrealistic. You kind of need to train them as they need to use a certain process or a certain part of the product. Just-in-time learning just seems to be the way to go. Are you seeing a lot more demand for that today?
Absolutely. You know, and it's even loosely called learning more and more these days. I think it really is a matter of performance support at the time of need, like you said, and, the guidance through a process. So even if you're not a new employee, you may be new to some software or to a new process change. As long as that content can be modified real time to whatever the individual needs today, because it changed from yesterday to today, it's that real-time capability. So even if what they learned in the classroom 2 months ago was true, and even if they retained 100% of it, that doesn't mean it's valid today because things change so rapidly. Whether the software is complex or incredibly elementary, if you will, but very powerful, it still goes to the question of how do I do this, what do I do today?
Yeah, absolutely, especially in a cloud world where we're sneaking out new releases overnight and nobody really knows it's coming, and the screen may not look like it did when you went through the training class.
There's nothing like a shock to that system in the morning when you get into work.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me go on to my next slide here, and I promised you some real-world examples, and I'd like to give a big shout-out to Maria Manning-Chapman, who is our VP of Research for Education Services, and she provided these case studies to me from actual members in her education services discipline that she's been working with, and what we're seeing is a direct correlation between adoption and revenue and margin improvement. So the first key finding is that trained customers buy more products. And one TSI member found that for every $1 sold in training, it equated to an additional $12 in products purchased. So the more training that customers purchased, the more products they ultimately were buying. The second finding is that trained customers require less support. And I guess that's obvious, but it's nice to see some actual data around it. Another of our TSA members established that trained customers, those that completed all of the recommended training for the products, had 3 times fewer support incidents. And with support incidents in the B2B environment costing $300, $400 or more, this can be a critical impact on your margins. And the final proof point here, I mentioned earlier some averages around renewal rates, but we do know that trained customers have higher renewal rates. And before I quoted some industry averages, but here is a real pace-setter company. A third TSI member found that trained customers renewed their subscription 92% of the time compared to 80% of those who did not opt in to the training. So Malcolm, I'm curious, I know you're working with a lot of companies on how to boost adoption through training. Are you seeing examples like this from your customers?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, we'll look at a couple at the end of our session today, but I'll join you when you shout out to Maria. I think the kinds of things she's been able to work with her constituents has been tremendous, and it's been great for us all. The one thing I would do is, I always, when Maria and I always get a chance to talk, we talk about training, but we also talk about the evolution of training. So it's almost like if we had a red pen, what we really want to do is focusing on changing the word trained to enabled. In other words, however your employees or the customers or the users are enabled to do fill in the blank, whatever their job happens to be with your software, that's really the nirvana. Because if training is, what we're saying is a good start, but we want to put things at people's fingertips, and we need to make sure, however they're enabled to do their job, all these statistics are not only true, they're actually greater than they might have been before.
Yeah, excellent point. Well, now I thank you for chiming in on my slides, and now I'm going to turn things over to you for your portion of the broadcast. So Mal, take it away.
Great. Thank you, John. Appreciate it. So what I really want to do is piggyback on pretty much everything as John has said and talk a little bit more specifics on some of the how-to and the focus area, not just in the methodology, but also to proving it, if you will. So when we talk about user adoption, one of the things that we really want to focus on is people. So we're going to make some assumptions here that the software that your company offers, that it works. So we're really not talking about does the software work, it's do the people work. They're the key to the success of any software rollout. So before, like John said, a client of yours or customer of yours retains or renews or doesn't, you can bet the first thing they're going to do is survey their employees to find out about the value and the functionality of some of the software that they have from you. So your success is based on enabling their user adoption of your software. And again, there's lots of ways to do that. Effective, relevant, engaging learning content on demand, in the classroom. But that next bullet there where it says customized, personalized, and contextual, that's everything. In other words, we almost have to pretend that every user of every one of your customers is a teenager where everything is about them or it doesn't matter or isn't true. So given that, we need to make sure that this guidance that John talked about and our on-demand learning is specific to them. And if not, it may or may not be of value, especially when we're talking about retention. And lastly, of course, is we want enjoyment. You get to enjoy customer adoption and retention. They get to enjoy, of course, success with the software so that they get what they want when they wrote the first check to your company. So again, I'll go back to some TSIA data that really is guiding this, and it's pretty much like John said. A different view of that same data is that when we're talking about achieving enterprise software success, that effective user adoption is by far and away the most significant value indicator of ultimate success. Again, the functionality, everybody wants to check the box that the software works. But then there are other aspects as far as organizational change, especially if we're dealing with a business transformation that's supported by your software that's being rolled out to the company. And that, again, focuses on process. So one of the things John said earlier, too, was about really making sure that users exploit the heck out of the software that they're using of yours. And a lot of times that comes down to just plain awareness. So we need to make sure that as part of this adoption focus, we're talking about awareness so that they're knowledgeable. Well, that takes information flow and knowledge management. But we're also now talking about exploiting the full functionality to keep them coming back for more. So what we find here is, again, the graphic of our life. This is true today. It's been true for a long time. I've been at this at companies that don't exist anymore, such as Digital Equipment Corporation from back in the 70s and 80s. I hate to say it. But this was true then, and it's true now, that when we're talking about this adoption curve, we spend a lot of time to the left of that dotted line where we actually implement or go live with the software. We spend a lot of time and attention in helping people learn about what's coming and then how to use what's coming. But then we have the party and the T-shirts at the Go Live event, and all of a sudden, there's the valley of death we want to absolutely avoid, and that's our sweet spot to make sure we keep that line as high as possible, which is that user application proficiency, so that everybody is happy at day 1, at day 100, at day 1,000, and they just keep on coming back for more. So we look at this from the standpoint of the software. If we change this graph and focus on it more from the standpoint of the user, your customers very often have a transient workforce, but they may not have a workforce with no variation, in which case people come into this software curve as opposed to it being related to the software rollout. So in other words, people are being onboarded to the company, and they're being onboarded to the use of your software. How do we address the onboarding of that so we do what we need to do? And then it goes back to the beautiful picture John had earlier with putting learning and guidance and performance support right at their fingertips so we're not dependent on that expensive classroom event that may or may not be repeated for the poor people. So when we're talking about benefits, one of the things we did a couple of years ago was actually contracted with a third party. It's called Hobson & Associates, and they interviewed a lot of our customers as far as where did they get value and the benefit. And what you're seeing here is the bottom, the x-axis, if you will, is focusing on what did they focus on. They're focusing on things like efficiency to produce what users need to do their job. On-demand learning, real-time performance support, embedded application guidance. Somebody's got to create that. And what we're now talking about is reducing that time is money, from an efficiency perspective. But then we get to a point where now we're talking beyond just the efficiency to support them to actually employee efficiency, which again, time is money. So can they do their work processes faster? Do they need less intervention and support from a help desk, which is the most expensive classroom in the world that we want to make sure we reduce? It's not to say there's not a place for the help desk, but we don't want them to be answering questions that start with those 3 dreaded words, how do I? Because it's an expensive way to answer that question, how do I do something? So let's talk a little bit more about what has to happen for this to be. And again, we talked a little bit about, I said some words before about awareness, but when we look at the entire curve, there are basically 3 steps along the way. They're not hard steps, they're more phases. So when we talk about this, we're talking about understanding as to what's coming, proficiency in use of the application, the new process, the new organization, and finally nirvana, where we're focusing on true full adoption and exploitation of what you have. So what it looks like from a tactics perspective, a lot of what today is about is developing the right content that will help with all three of those phases in the right format. These days, it's not just important that it's HTML versus Flash, if you will, but what's very important is that it's also able to be deployed and accessed on a mobile device. And what mobile device? And the answer is any mobile device. So we need to make sure that everybody has no excuse about accessing the content to support their own performance. But again, at the right time, fingertips, right when they need what they need and when they need it and why they need it. But then the last part is that validation. We have to, I think these days, look to the accountability aspect of this. It's not all about ensuring people do their job. It's ensuring that they can support themselves in doing their own job. How do we know? We know because they've shown us that they've received the information. They've actually utilized and exploited the context-sensitive help and support and received and understood the information pushed to them. So now we're talking about the validation and accountability, not just availability of this learning content, but truly using it. The applications that we sort of talked around from Ansili are the ones listed at the bottom here. I mostly just want to point out during this project lifecycle that someone might, one of your customers might be involved in. As you see, you start on the left, you go live, but then really ongoing sustainment is where what John said about that retention is key, because that's where people live as opposed to just a one-day event when the software goes live. But now we're talking about UPerform for a single source authoring of content creation and maintenance and management. Managing the learning event through an LMS. In application guidance, the screenshot that John had showed earlier was from the application we have, UGuide, that again, you see our branding is a lowercase u and the verb that represents what it is and what it does. And then finally, UAlign, where not everything about how users are successful is about how to use the software. It may be about with what to use your software and with whom to use your software. In other words, more process-based. So we focus on UAlign to make sure people know what to do, when to do, and as well, how to do it with your software. So let's talk about three situations, three specific tactics. First is going to be about managing and supporting performance to get to this state of nirvana that we both talked about. Here's an example of how one customer that's of an PSIA constituent or member, HP, actually proved their value. So when they talked about managing and supporting performance, you see the stats of this global bank on the left, quite a large employee base. They focused on upgrading HP software from what they had to the latest version. And again, we're talking about a large stakeholder group, as you see on the left here. But that said, large amount of people, not a large amount of time to do what's needed. So to steal one of their lines, that HP Art, which is HP's version of using UPerform to create that content and actually use our software to customize that content, is the number one reason we were able to go live the way we did, which means successfully. Art is an absolutely phenomenal enabling tool, and I think that enabling is the most important thing there, because we're not always talking about training alone. Just talking around their story that you can read here yourself, you see I think the most important part here is that they didn't talk just about managing training. They put their learning content that they used in the classroom right at the fingertips of the workers themselves, which greatly reduced the dependence on that expensive classroom and did their best to ensure that people were able to support their own performance. Again, if you look at the stats down the bottom right here, again, they're using that training word. I think if I had my red pen, I would use that enable word again. They touched 6,500 people with content, with events, and with performance support to do what they needed to do, because they were able to employ context-sensitive help or deployment of this customized content that UPerform enabled them to do through HP's application, which is called HP Art, Adoption Readiness Tool. I love that first word of that, adoption. Second, another tactic, not just managing training and performance, but now managing blended learning and change. a client of ours, Columbia Sportswear, that actually purchased our application through SAP, another TSIA member as well. They, as you see here on the top right, I think we all are aware of Columbia Sportswear, a large retail company focused in the Northwest on sportswear, just as it says. They were going through some specific changes from an SAP rollout, and with that, they used UPerform to create blended learning to support their global curriculum and materials to help their end-user training strategy. That training strategy involved, again, embedding the content right within their application and the very, very same content that was developed for the classroom. So again, if John's and my friend Maria were on, she would talk about the value of that single source content, that you develop it once and then explode or publish it into many formats to enable this process of making it available in the classroom, but also at people's fingertips, whether it be on a PC, on an iPad, in a phone, whatever it happens to be. The results, as you see there, were a highly successful project rollout. If I was to put words in their mouth here, again, it was training results, but if you look down the bottom left here, the name of their project for this ERP rollout was Global Business Transformation. So when they talk about success, they're not talking about success of learning. They're talking about success of the initiative called Global Business Transformation, which is based on a significant ERP rollout. It was great the way they put that together. They had statistics here about training, but it all leads to that final end state of adoption. Third tactic, focusing or managing communication and change. So sometimes, like we both talked about today, it's about awareness as much as it is training. So in this case, again, I'll highlight Columbia Sportswear. They actually utilized another one of our applications in Silently Ualign. In this case, as you see in what's written here, that what they've done is they actually rolled out a new time management system, both hardware and software within their stores throughout the U.S. So what they needed to do was push a lot of information about the change, push a lot of information to store managers in order for them to enable their teams. So again, when they use this quote down the bottom here, the project was a huge success, they're not talking about their training was a success. What they're talking about is the rollout of their software and hardware for time management in stores was a huge success. And they saw Ualign as a key enabler of the tactics of managing the communication and change, so that's the case. So I think if there was any lesson to take away here, being within corporate education for many years, like I alluded to earlier, in the past we've talked a lot about learning objectives. Now we're in a great place and we're talking about performance objectives. It's a great thing to finally see. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Inga, and we'll go to see if there are any questions.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Mal and John, for a fantastic presentation. You shared a lot of really interesting and insightful data today. And as you can see, Anxiety is one of our sponsors for upcoming conference in October. And if you want to check them out and what they have to offer, please stop by their booth next month in Las Vegas. And yes, we are moving on to the Q&A portion of today's webinar. And if you have a question for Mal or John, take this opportunity to ask those questions live via the questions panel. And if you enjoyed today's presentation and the content that was presented, also be sure to check out our upcoming webinars on tsa.com and browse through our upcoming topics and register for them today. So our first question is for Mal. For your Anxiety software, can someone easily use the published content in a traditional instructor-led classroom?
Sure, absolutely. It may be interactive or recorded simulations, but they're absolutely assets you can create there. It can actually be used to create I'll call it not e-learning, but learning that can be used in a projected form, and it could also, with an instructor facilitation or self-facilitation. So that very same asset can be used in a classroom on their own, and then all the assets of documentation, these multi-format publishing that Maria talks about, especially the simulation aspect of the software. So yeah, the beautiful thing is develop it once and use it in many different formats. But again, ultimately, hopefully, at the point of need for the worker.
Thank you, Mal. And we'll just squeeze in one more quick question. So this is from Mal. Do you see any cultural challenges on getting started with your software?
I don't see any cultural challenges, no. I think there could be some investment challenges because now we're talking about shifting how we spend our money away from what may have been thought of as the only method of enabling a team, which is in a traditional classroom with an instructor up front. Now we're talking about shifting so we actually can demonstrate how people can actually be more enabled than they might have been before, but using a different use of that same dollar, perhaps. So I'm going to say it's more of a financial shift in focus and investment rather than cultural alone.
Thank you, Mel. So we are coming to the conclusion of today's webinar. I'd like to take this time to thank everyone for joining us on today's webinar. And a quick reminder to everyone that a link to the recorded version of today's webinar and the PDF of the presentation will be sent out in the next 24 hours via email. And any questions that we didn't get to today, we will be sure to follow up with you via email as well. Thank you for taking the time to join us in today's webinar, User Adoption, Getting Past the Buzz to the Value and Tactics, brought to you by TSIA and sponsored by Ansiley. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar very soon. Have a great day, everyone.